All right, just to wrap up Congress, the legislative branch, I want to do a House versus the Senate chart um, and compare the two chambers. So we're going to even start with just the basics, the size of the constituency. Remember the House, they have a much more homogeneous constituency thanks to gerrymandering. They kind of get to pick the people that they represent by packing and cracking certain types of voters into districts. And of course, a district is just a less number of people, so they have less variety of needs to accommodate. The intention was that they were going to be less experienced. They were going to be a younger group. They were going to need more leadership. The procedures are more formal. The speaker has more power. Right, the speaker being the most important position, especially with that referral power to be able to give a certain committee a bill to either help it flourish or to help or to kill the bill. Their powers, they begin the impeachment process. They have power of the purse, taxing and spending. They break electoral ties. They have a rules committee that determined whether or not a bill can be debated or a bill can be amended. If a bill can be amended, it has to have germaneness, which means any of the amendments must have to do with the original text of the bill. Discharge petitions are also a thing in the House where members of the House can require a committee to let go of a bill that they might be sitting on in order to have an up or down vote on the floor. In the Senate, they have a more diverse population that they must accommodate because they represent an entire state. Of course, if there is an at-large district like the state of Montana or Wyoming where the rep is going to serve everybody in the district or everybody in the state because the population is so small in the state. But for the most part, senators have a much more diverse population that they have to appease. They have more experience, and because they have more experience, leadership isn't as important, and each member has more power over the outcome of laws. They approve treaties, confirm appointments, try impeachments. There's no limits on debate. They can filibuster or just even threaten to filibuster if you're the minority party to prevent a bill from going to the floor for vote. You have no need for germaneness on your riders and earmarks. They don't have to be relevant. And the Senate can use holds. So if a member of the Senate wants to prevent a bill from leaving committee to go to floor debate, they can request a hold. Okay, now I told you like Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act was 1,200 pages. And then, of course, there's committee reports that will sum up the major highlights of the piece of legislation. And y'all are like, who does that? Who does those committee reports? Who reads that legislation? Well, that is your congressional staffers. Okay, so these are the people who do most of the real work in Congress. You have staffers at your offices in your localities. So, like, Mark Warner has a staffer in Richmond. Bobby Scott has staffers in in Norfolk and I think in Hampton. I think he has them in both. If not, he at least has them in Hampton. And then you're going to have your staff in DC. And then you're going to also have your committee staffers. So not only do the individual members of Congress have staff working for them, but the committees do. So like the Agricultural Committee has a staff. The Armed Services Committee has a staff. And they're going to organize all of those hearings that happens in the second step of how a bill becomes a law. When they pull in experts to give testimony during the markup process, the staffers are going to organize that. The committee staffers are going to draft reports, the committee reports. They're going to write the legislation in a lot of cases, and they're going to communicate with the executive branch, like the members of the White House who want maybe a certain piece of legislation to be changed. Okay, so that's the staffers. Okay, another thing that you will find in Congress is caucuses, and these are going to be different than your primaries and caucuses. In this case, these are going to just be the informal organizations. I like to call them the clubs. They're the clubs of Congress. So you're going to join a caucus because you have some similar interest to the other members that are in it. So again, definition is an informal organization in Congress that has some similar interest, and they try to influence legislation. So examples of some caucuses would be like the Black Caucus, or like the Black Congressional Caucus, or the Congress Women's Caucus, the Sun Belt Caucus. There's like the Progressive Caucus, the Tea Party Caucus. So like just kind of like clubs. And it's just another outlet that Congress members can use to try to shape the policy agenda without necessarily relying on committee work or relying on interest groups. All right, to wrap it up, the last thing I want to talk about is the legislative veto. The legislative veto is basically an attempt by Congress to try to reject something that the executive branch is doing. So it's similar to judicial review, so it would be like legislative review of executive branch actions. So when legislative vetoes existed, basically what Congress would do is vote to reject or deny the president's ability to do something. So let's say the president were to grant, now, of course, Trump wouldn't do this, but let's say the president were to grant amnesty to illegal immigrants. So he would say everybody who's in this country illegally can stay and work towards a path to citizenship. Congress could, with the idea of a legislative veto, vote to reject the action. Now, of course, this seems like a violation of checks and balances, because if the president is the head of the executive branch and he issues an executive order, or he wants to, organize the executive branch in some way, he should be able to do that. The Supreme Court agreed. So in INS versus Chatta, the Supreme Court gave the executive branch the power to enforce laws the way that they see fit, and then Congress couldn't reject their actions. All right. Okay, last couple of details that I just want to cover. Okay, so there are different types of legislation. I call them the sun legislation. So we have sunset legislation. So sometimes when Congress writes a law, they're not sure how well it's going to work out, or maybe they don't know if it's going to be needed for ever, and they put an expiration date on it. And then the law would have to be renewed, or it's no longer the law. So an example of sunset legislation would be the Brady Bill, like gun background check, or not the background checks, but the legislation that prevented like automatic weapons and semi-automatic weapons that actually sunset, and it was never renewed. So now you can get basically automatic, more or less automatic weapons. Or you can get semi-automatic weapons that you can modify to be basically automatic weapons. And then next is sunset legislation, and transparency spelled wrong. Get over it. Spell it right. All right, so sunshine legislation is legislation that is there to shine a light on the actions of government and to create transparency. So piece of sunshine legislation would be something that, like the Freedom of Information Act, that requires government agencies and just government officials to be as transparent as possible with the American people about what they're doing, as long as it doesn't hurt national security. Okay, and then just to kind of wrap up, go through the how a bill becomes a law process. Again, in a typical year, more than 5,000 bills are introduced in Congress, but only about 150 of them become law. They can only be introduced by a member of Congress. So a bill can be introduced in the House, it's going to be introduced in the hopper, or in the Senate, it's going to be introduced on the floor. It's going to go to committees and subcommittees to get marked up, where it's going to go through hearings, where they get testimony from experts. So that happens on both sides. It's going to be voted on by the committee for up or down vote. Will they kill the bill, which they do most of the time, or will they report on it favorably and move it on? In the House, see, this is missing the Rules Committee. So in the House, it's going to go to the Rules Committee. Then in the Senate, it just goes straight to the floor where it could be debated. And remember, in the Senate, they can filibuster, but in the House, they can only debate for 5 minutes. And if they want to add anything, it has to have germaneness. But in the Senate, if they want to add something, it does not have to have germaneness, so they could put irrelevant riders and earmarks on a piece of legislation. All right, so then the two different versions of the bill are going to go to a conference committee where they're going to compromise on the legislation. Oops. Then it's going to go back for a final passage in both chambers before it ends up with the president, where he can either sign or veto it, or on rare occasion pocket veto.